This is Tyler, your antisocial critic and the host of the AntiSocial Network, your number one source for anachronistic conversations online. Come join us each week to hear opinions from some of the best voices discussing entertainment, politics, religion, and modern life on the internet today, most of which you've never heard of, but I have. This week we're joined by Ben Stanhope. He is a YouTuber who has a MA in Manuscript Studies from the University of Hamburg and a notable enemy of many prominent museums on the internet. How's it going?
It's not too bad. How about yourself?
Pretty good. Like I mentioned before, my computer decides to kill itself tonight, so hopefully we don't have any more explosions in the meantime. But for now, we are good. So, you recently had your first book published. Can you tell people who don't know who you are about yourself and what you just published?
Sure. I have a BA from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in biblical studies stuff and philosophy, and then from there, I started out actually to be an apologist, and then I became so fascinated with the Hebrew Bible and the Hebrew language that I went on to do an MA in Hebrew seals. Essentially was the topic of my master's thesis. And during my undergraduate at seminary, me and some friends, we went up to see the Creation Museum. I live in Kentucky. So the Creation Museum that's run by the Young Earth organization, Answers in Genesis. And sounds like I'm getting some echo. Is there a way to cancel it?
I'm not hearing it on my end, but is it bad or?
Let's see if it's gone now. Yeah, it sounds like it's gone.
All right.
But yeah, so me and some friends took a trip up to the Creation Museum, and even that early on in my education, I noticed a lot of just blatant issues in the museum. For example, there was a wax figure of Moses holding the Ten Commandments, and the Ten Commandments are totally misspelled. They're in the wrong Hebrew script. Just a lot of things like that. There were a few things in the museum that Answers in Genesis tells people not to say on their own website, like the myth that Voltaire's house was created into a Bible factory after he died. So I wrote up a little piece on the internet, about the things that we had seen that we thought were kind of odd in the museum. And then from there, it ended up becoming such a big thing with a lot of interest that I had enough material, I realized, to write an entire book on the subject of issues that I saw in the museum, especially after I did my master's thesis and was more in tune with these sort of things.
Was that the same thing as your master's thesis, or were they two separate things?
My master's thesis was on Hebrew seals of the late Iron Age, and particularly how they use Egyptian iconography on them, and what the significance of that is. Because it's very strange when you see seals belonging to royal figures like Hebrew kings, and then they have what look like Egyptian gods depicted on them when they're supposed to be monotheists.
Do we have? I hear a lot about evangelical organizations will always brag about look at all these archaeological evidence we have of we finally found King David's all these are how much is truth is in there in that in terms of how much we have from ancient ancient Jewish culture.
I would say before the monarchy split. So after the monarchy split, the Bible is pretty historically accurate with regards to everything, and everyone kind of agrees on that. So, it's really cool that we have Hezekiah's seal, and that we have, artifacts from the reign of Uzziah and so forth. But I don't think anybody was really doubting their existence to begin with. Guys like King David and Solomon, when we find artifacts that are that could be associated with them, it's actually pretty cool because there's a lot more doubt of historicity of events from that time period.
Do we have any real proof, outside of the Bible itself? Do we have much archaeological evidence of them, or?
As far as Solomon, I'm not too familiar with the archaeology that far back, but I know King David, we have the Tel Dan Stela, which seems to contain an allusion to him. So there is some pretty interesting stuff, but like I said, that pushes it a little bit further back than I'm terribly familiar with.
Well, we just kind of moving into discussion, but let's go back all the way to the beginning. So, obviously, if you wrote your book on Genesis, this is obviously something that's been part of your primary kind of exploration in all of your academic work. What is the book of Genesis then, for the sake of discussion, and why do people get it wrong so easily?
Yeah, so the book of Genesis, let's see how to frame this. Well, Genesis 1, I believe, was written by a source that's typically called P by scholars. And then there's the J and the E source, which I know a lot of evangelicals have issues with. I myself have some issues with whether or not J and E can be separated and dated accurately. But typically those are dated back to like the 9th and 10th century, so they're pretty old. And they make up a significant portion of the book of Genesis. But Genesis 1, which is particularly what my book is most about, I believe that was written during the Babylonian period, which would have been around roughly 597 BC. So it's actually pretty late. And it's interesting, a lot of Christians, I think, just assume that Genesis 1 must be like the oldest text in the Bible just because it comes first chronologically. But yeah, I think it's actually a later text. And the reason for that, well, take like a lot of people think that Moses must have written the entire Torah, which, like, I don't deny that there's probably a lot of traditions in there that go back to a historical Moses and perhaps even some writings. But I don't think, for example, that the P source that wrote Genesis 1 was written by Moses, even if it stands on some traditions ultimately deriving from him, because it's full of so much Mesopotamian material and like so much allusions to Mesopotamian mythology. Like it looks like the author of the flood story was familiar with the Mesopotamian version of the flood story. You have the story of Babel, which seems to show some familiarity with myth from Mesopotamia and so forth. So that's not really something that Moses, living in Egypt and getting as far as the Transjordan, he wouldn't have really been dealing with all that stuff all the way in Iraq, 800 miles away. And everything I've just said, like, you can be a conservative, like, evangelical Christian and believe that you don't have to believe that the entirety of everything in the Torah was written exactly by Moses as it is today. There are certain things that he just couldn't have written, like the report of his own death, for example.
Oh man, but it definitely. I mean, I don't have much of a problem with that read, but I can already hear my both my Christian and atheist friends like lining up their list of complaints already, because when you take the middle road, you don't get invited to any parties. But like,
exactly,
yeah,
exactly, yeah.
So what is the way one approaches this then? In a way that's intellectually honest and with fair to what the academia is telling us about the material, because obviously if there's all this stuff, like there's so much cultural bleed in, what is any Christian I know nowadays basically say if the Bible is that deeply permeated by pagan material, then it's corrupted in some source. And there's so many Christian traditions that have been founded just on the idea that the Bible is corrupted and that we have to find the one true version of it.
Like, think about that for a second.
I'm sorry. I'm not trying to throw you too many hard curveballs, but
in terms of like, because especially my master's thesis, for example, I do talk a lot about how there's outside cultural influence on the biblical authors, and overwhelmingly, like, I think the biblical authors are like straight up front about it and like aren't concerned about it like we are. It's kind of funny, but like they'll take texts regarding Baal and they'll apply them to their god Yahweh. They'll take symbolism from other gods in the ancient Near East and apply them to Yahweh and that sort of a thing. And it's like, it's done openly. And we have issues with it because we have this theological tradition behind us where we didn't know the context of the ancient Near East. And it challenges our theological traditions, but it's not really a problem if you're thinking about the Bible the way that an ancient Israelite would have.
That kind of sounds like approaching the Bible in the way we approach something like Herodotus or Livy, where it's for like even the people back then knew it 100% wasn't literal, but this is the story behind it. This is the implicit meaning. This is what it felt like to be in this kind of like moment of civilization, if that makes sense. Like,
Yeah, that's kind of like the main theme of my book is like I just want people to read the Bible like you would Herodotus or just like Homer's Iliad or the Odyssey. Like like approach it with curiosity and the fact that it's an ancient text, and don't assume that you know everything and try to make it conform to all of your preconceptions.
so I guess this leads us to the spicy question: Does the fact that the Creation Museum leads Genesis 1 as 100% literally actively harm Christians, or does it, or Christians and the Christian faith, or is it just kind of a holdover from the fact that there's such a huge fundamentalist grip on the faith?
Yeah, I think the museum offers a service. This is kind of cynical, but they do a really good job. Like, there's so many people out there that like they just need a stable worldview to live their lives. Maybe they don't have all this time to invest into deep biblical study, which I totally respect that. But yeah, if you need simple pat answers to questions, like they're a good website to go to and they'll give you the simple answers. The problem is people like me, I have so many friends like this. We just grew out of it so fast, and we needed more complex answers. Like, even when I read articles of theirs that I agree with fully, like the scholarship's just way too simplistic. And I can give some examples to back this up since it's such a cynical thing to say, but like for example, they date the flood, Noah's flood. They count up the genealogies in Genesis and they date Noah's flood to like 2300 BC, which forces them to take all of human civilization and compress it to after that date, which is like the middle of the Egyptian Old Kingdom. So you have to rewrite the entirety of Egyptian chronology, and the existence of entire Egyptian cities have to be redated, and the pyramids have to be redated. So like it's extremely conspiratorial to relocate all of human history after that date. That was like the height of the Akkadian Empire, like the turn of the Akkadian Empire coming to power. Let's see what. Oh yeah, they also have dinosaurs brought onto the ark, for example, right? So you had the flood in like 2300 BC, which is when most of them date it. Then you got dinosaurs on the ark, which means that dinosaurs must have gone extinct, you know what, in the Egyptian Middle Kingdom, which I know that they have all these artifacts they claim depict dinosaurs, and I critique them in the back of my book. But like, imagine if human beings like during like the second millennium or during like the Egyptian Middle Kingdom, like we're living alongside dinosaurs, like they'd be drawing those everywhere. Like we'd have bones in the archaeology of them like they had used, and it would just be all over the place in the ancient world. So again, it's super conspiratorial, and we could give lots of examples like that where it's just the answers they give are really simplistic and they create a lot of problems. You essentially have to believe that there's this mass sort of scientific conspiracy across the globe, you know, within physics, within evolution, within paleontology and archaeology. You have to believe that the vast majority of scientists don't know what they're talking about. They're either incompetent or they're suppressing the truth and unrighteousness. And yeah, a lot of people have issues with that. They grow out of it. So I think in that sense, they kind of do make the museum does kind of make Christianity look ridiculous.
Yeah, I actually had the
sorry to
opportunity.
say.
I mean, I went there last year, so I'm not. It was a very fun experience in the sense that it was very entertaining, and I was never bored at any point because of it. But it was one of the 2 times in my life I've experienced that thing, a rare thing I call spiritual whiplash, where you go into a thing expecting awe and you come out of it just completely just wiped, like it's all just sucked out of you at once. The only other time I had that was when I visited the Mormon temple in Salt Lake City, and then a friend of mine explained to me what their theology was without like any like prep or explain, just drop it all in my lap. It's like you just go from like complete like I just walked out of the most beautiful cathedral in my life to that in under 5 minutes, and it just completely just you just like hitting a wall. And seeing the Creation Museum was kind of like that, where you see this incredible work of like almost incredible work of engineering. Is just building a giant boat, but you go inside it, and so much of it is just kind of running in circles. It's trying to explain something.
I went to the Ark Encounter, which is like a whole like separate from the museum, kind of far off, far out of the way.
I went to both.
And yeah, the Ark Encounter. I think their tagline, like the museum's tagline, is "Prepare to Believe." But like I went and I was like, just seeing it like up front in person, the Ark, like it like made me like question my beliefs, because it's like, wow, they spent all this work, building this thing. Which of course later I found out, like John Walton's book, for example, he shows how like the measurements of the Ark in the Bible, there's no reason to take them necessarily literally, because when you look at the layout of, for example, temples and like the boats that are built in the Babylonian text, for example, the numbers are extremely symbolic and impractical. So yeah,
they had the.
But I remember getting the distinct impression of like I could see how this could like damage people's faith, just the magnitude of the things being claimed in here.
I mean, I know I saw a lot of people there, so obviously this was something that a lot of people were going in there just feeling the awe, and I'm like, and I when I was in high school, I had the opportunity when I was in choir to sing at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York, and I actually felt it there, because it's an actual old school Episcopalian cathedral, like done in the style of a classic like giant European cathedral, and like there's actual awe here. You're actually seeing something incredible that people are putting centuries of work into, and like that's if Christians want to be impressive, that's the kind of thing they need to do. They need to kind of inspire the sense of something greater than yourself, and I get the sense that when I walked into the Creation Museum, it was like I said, it's entertaining, but unless you absolutely need to have this one thing convinced for you for the rest of your faith to be salient, I definitely can't help but think it would make you make a Christian much more rigid, if anything else.
Yeah, that's actually one thing that I kind of envy about Catholicism, is like when I went to Europe and saw all these cathedrals, and like for historical reasons, Protestantism, a lot of Protestantism is like so aesthetically bare, and it's like, I don't know, I was just kind of jealous of the beauty and like all the emotions that those cathedrals would evoke.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things they do generally get really right. I mean that definitely creates a kind of a need for Protestants to try to come up with our version of that, but in a Protestant way. And
I guess we were scared, like it's kind of like superstitious or like not authentic or something like that.
Yeah, there does seem to be kind of a weird anti-superstition tract in Christianity, for better or worse, and it tends to manifest in very strange ways, where the giant 500-foot boat is more likely than any of the weird things the Catholics do. But even as an evangelical, I mean, like I see what the teenager who wants to join Catholicism after seeing his Protestant parents is getting at. But how you were saying earlier that you kind of think that it's understandable for the lay Christian to kind of want that simplistic answer. Like, what is the proper way someone, like, if they do want to stay up to date with the science, what should they do if they're not intellectually inclined, like people like yourself? Like, isn't most of this cutting edge research kind of not widely disseminated? Like,
yeah, I think well, we have guys like John Walton and Michael Heiser that do like just such an incredible job, like making it digestible. And in my opinion, like it's actually really easy to keep up with a lot of biblical studies. Like if you, for example, if you go to google.scholar.com and you type in any subject of interest, you'll get dozens of articles for free, like journal articles. And biblical studies is so much easier to read and comprehend than like other fields like social science and that sort of thing, where it's like all mathematical. But I think what's kind of going on historically is people aren't really being taught how to interpret the Bible, because pastors aren't being taught how to interpret the Bible. And the reason pastors aren't being taught how to interpret the Bible contextually and to model that for congregations, I think it's just it's a historical artifact of the fact that like ancient Near Eastern literature and archaeology has kind of only been around since post World War II. Like we had archaeology of the Near East before then, but for the most part, it was like a real endeavor. It was like after World War II, so it's kind of brand new historically. So, look, I went to seminary and I know what it's like and how people are trained to be pastors. And I took one class in ancient Near Eastern history to get my degree. I took nothing in Second Temple Judaism, so like I had one class in the context of the Bible, and that's it. And then I had like over a dozen classes in church history and history of interpretation, philosophy, how Augustine interpreted the Bible, how John Calvin and Martin Luther interpreted it, and all that. So I think like historically the church just hasn't caught up with all the information that's available. And if I wanted to be cynical, I could also like I also think like a lot of church people really just aren't interested in a real academic Bible study. My experience is that they're actually kind of terrified of the Bible because it's kind of scary to read the Bible if it's your worldview, because what if you encounter something that could harm your faith or damage your faith, which is really, really inconvenient because it could like really mess you up and destabilize you, which is totally understandable. I've been through like 20 faith crises throughout my life. But yeah, I think the solution is just for people, which I've seen like this revolution happen online, like with Michael Heiser and John Walton. And when I published my book, I didn't think anybody would really care about it, but like it's actually done pretty well. So I think there's like a massive amount of interest that's growing within the church. And hopefully that'll continue, and then, pastors will catch up and seminaries will catch up.
Yeah, I'm how do you square the analysis with what everything that's kind of coming out? Because my inclination as someone who does writing online is to kind of approach the Bible like as a literary primarily, and how do you sorry, my tongue's getting tied. I tend to approach the Bible first and foremost as literature. That way I can kind of get a sense of what the author's trying to say through the text. How does the Near Eastern context change the interpretation in the sense that, like I get the sense with something like Leviathan and Behemoth, God submitting them in Job is the implication that the author is trying to say is that God is powerful enough to tame the physical manifestations of chaos that are spread across the world. So how does approaching it with this research change does it change the interpretation for you, or does it change it enough that it should affect people's daily lives?
I don't think it necessarily changes like core like doctrines within religion, for the most part. So like there's no reason for people to be like terrified of it. A lot of people are scared that would happen, but it does make the Bible certainly like tremendously more interesting. That's an interesting question, because I can give tons of examples of where the context changes meanings of passages and informs them. But yeah, overall, I would say like it just makes the Bible much more interesting. I guess it is particularly impactful on people's lives when it comes to Genesis 1. So, for example, I think that the reason that the universe is created in 7 days because it's being built as a temple, and the 7 days were selected because that's the inauguration period of a temple, and that's a theological message, not a scientific message. And the way that changed my life to understand that information is that I no longer like had to be terrified of modern science. I no longer had to believe that the entire universe is only roughly 6,000 years old. I gained a lot more respect for modern science. I used to be highly, highly conspiratorial and like anti-authoritarian and against like the idea of experts in science, and I'm not anymore. So there are ways, I suppose, that like particularly in Genesis 1, where it does have a real impact on people's lives.
The translations do make a big difference, though. I was reading the New International Version recently for my Bible studies. Then I got to the end of Job, and it translates Leviathan as alligator, and I immediately knew I needed to put it down. Like, okay, what is this getting wrong? I mean, obviously that's one of the more contentious things that everyone comes back to is like, what is this? What is this? What is this? Are there any points where it actually affects how people are supposed to go about their daily lives specifically, or is it just archaic elements of the Bible that just don't quite mesh with a modern worldview like that, just like the supernatural elements?
I'm not sure if I totally understand your question. Do you have anything in mind, or?
Well,
I guess you're just.
I mean, I'm guessing asking generally, but I'm just asking if there are any points where the translation is botched so severely that it actually affects what the Bible wants people to kind of get about it in terms of like how they go about daily life. I mean, I'm thinking about this almost in like an Aristotelian sense, where what is your categorical imperative for living out a proper daily life? Is there any point where the translations affect that, or is it just does it just kind of affect the way you look at God in a cosmological sense, where most of these translation errors are related to the supernatural elements as opposed to the how you live it elements?
That's a really interesting question.
I know
that there probably are examples, but it's hard for me to think of one off the top of my head.
I was just reading C.S. Lewis's Reflections on the Psalms, and he talks a lot about how the nature of revelation changes between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Where if you're if you're living in the Old Testament, the fact that there is no clear demarcation of an afterlife, it changes how the way you view God and the way you view your daily life. And you can kind of sense that in Psalms, where people are a lot more.
That's a good example.
They're a lot more vengeful, and they're a lot more focused on their like justice in this life. Whereas the way the Bible, the New Testament's been translated, it tends to make people more thoughtful of how their sins manifest in this life, because your goal is to get to the next life, as opposed to not. And I could be wrong, because I keep going back and forth as to whether or not Sheol is supposed to be literal in the Old Testament or not. But
there are like there's like this evolving theology of the underworld and the afterlife within the Old Testament, and you get little hints that, like, you know, in the Psalms where psalmists will sing like that they hope to be with God in heaven when they die, but then you get a ton of other texts, and especially the earlier texts, that just have you going straight to the underworld. It's underworld for everybody without exception, which is what people typically believed in the ancient Near East. And it's like it's actually like such a grim view of reality that it's hard to comprehend entire civilizations believing this and actually succeeding well. Like, same thing in Greek religion. Everybody goes to hell when they die, and they're just like these sort of shades of the dead. And I could totally see that the New Testament and Jesus' apocalyptic message and this idea of going to heaven to be with God is like, that would have tremendous impact on how you live your life in certain ways compared to like Old Testament theology. I was also thinking, when you were talking, like, I don't know if you remember the courtship movement, which I made a video about this, but like, it was in full swing when I was like young enough to be getting into dating, and
same.
I'd say that would be an example where like ancient Near Eastern context can have like really big impact on how you live your life, and it was very important to me at the time, and a lot of people. Where like it's important to get certain translations right. It's important to get the cultural context right, in order to understand some of the courtship practices in the Bible, and like, should you be applying these to today? So I suppose we provided two examples, at least.
Yeah, and it's curious. And the other thing it tends to bleed in from the way I think about this is how much of the Old Testament theology is still supposed to be true in light of what we learn in the New Testament. Because one of my best friends is I think she's the last surviving Christian mortalist, and she's trying to convince me that the afterlife is not necessarily defended in the New Testament, and I haven't quite been she hasn't convinced me, but it's one of those things where you can read the Old Testament and it seems to set up a worldview that's, if it wasn't for the fact that Paul explains all of it, it almost feels like a completely different religion for a lot of the time, where it just this much more dour, like mortal world where there's less certainty in the afterlife, and your only hope is in the entire collective of humanity putting their trust in God, as opposed to the New Testament, which seems to be a lot more personal, and it changes so much about what we understand through Revelations, especially.
Yeah, there is a massive change, and that change is probably part of the reason why Christianity connected with the culture so well. To a degree that Judaism, which had already been around, did not. But yeah, the view that your friend's trying to convince you of, I don't think I've ever even heard of that.
Well, it's an older belief. I mean, I know. Apparently,
it's an older, yeah.
John Milton apparently believed in it. So.
Oh, I think I vaguely remember hearing about that, like in a class when you were reading Milton.
Yeah, essentially it's the belief that when you die, there's no soul that goes to heaven. Your soul is a part of your body, and that when you die, you just stay dead until the end of time, when you're resurrected from the dead, and that.
Oh, okay.
That's when you're brought back. So essentially it's putting greater emphasis on the resurrection at the end of time, as opposed to the idea that you go to heaven during the intermediate time. And then at the end of time, heaven meets earth, and everything kind of mushes into one. But
okay, yeah, I have heard of that view. Then, yeah. I mean, I'm totally ignorant about the subject, but yeah, I've heard of it.
Yeah, I'm getting a first-hand lesson in a lot of it. And apparently her brother wrote a master's thesis on it, and they sent that to me, and I've been paging through it slowly for the past 5 years or so. So eventually, I'll be able to speak about it in. It's in some sort of terms, but we'll see if they actually manage to convert me to heresy or not. But and again, moving on to the questions I had you prepared for earlier. As a theist, what is the best way to approach the supernatural elements of the Old Testament, especially in their Near Eastern context? Because Michael Heiser, in his books, he basically lays out the idea that all the kind of obscure elements, like the giants and the Nephilim, were the most kind of supernatural versions of themselves, and he lays out there is evidence in the Book of Enoch. Like, how should we approach these elements, knowing what we know about the world? Like, should Christians believe that the Bible believed that they're real things, or should Christians believe that they were giants and Nephilim at some point?
Yeah. Well, one thing I've been thinking about, like, people say, like, the standard for being a Christian, you believe in the resurrection, and, like, that's the core thing that makes you a Christian. But, like, one of the things that makes Christianity interesting is that, like, if you believe in the resurrection, there are a lot of contingent beliefs that kind of have to come with that. Like, I think every historical Jesus scholar on the planet would agree that Jesus taught, like, there's this coming apocalypse, and that he kind of cut the teeth of his early ministry on casting demons out of people, exorcisms. So, like, I have a really hard time seeing how someone could be a Christian and not believe in the existence of demons, because it was so central to the historical Jesus' ministry. Like, no matter how liberal you are, like, everyone agrees that Jesus cast out demons, like, as part of his ministry. And if you believe in demons, you kind of got to believe in angels, as far as I could tell. So, a certain degree of supernaturalism certainly, like, seems necessary, as far as I can tell, to be a Christian. I mean, who am I to dictate who's a Christian or not? But, like, it seems pretty hard to weasel your way out of that. As far as the Nephilim question, I think it's 2 Peter. I think I have it written down. 2 Peter 2:4 and Jude 6. They both mention this event in Genesis 6, and they explain what they think of it, and they think that what all ancient Jews pretty much believed. They think that there were these divine beings who came down to earth, had sex with human women, that produced a race of giants. And 2 Peter, I believe it's 2 Peter, either that or Jude, literally, like, names the Book of Enoch and connects it to this statement. So, like, we know what they're getting at, because the Book of Enoch is entirely about that subject. In fact, the Book of Enoch teaches that the origin of demons is Slade Nephilim, when Nephilim were killed by in Joshua's wars and so forth. That's their spirits remained on Earth, and those are the origins of demons within Hebrew theology.
I need a drink.
So the question: does someone have to believe that to be a Christian? Again, I have no authority on on who should be a Christian or not, but like it seems to me like that belief is maybe distal enough from the central claims of Jesus that like it would be unreasonable for a church to say like to excommunicate someone for not believing in that, maybe, but yeah, on the issue of like, did giants exist in the past? I've never seen any like archaeological evidence that. I mean, for real though, like people think that this was a thing because there's so many images floating around on the internet, like photoshopped images of giants and stuff. But like, as far as I can tell, they've all been refuted. There is several things to consider. There's a scholar named Adrian Mayor who wrote a book about how people would find fossils in the ancient world, and they would interpret them and build mythologies essentially around these fossils that they discovered. And I think she's basically proven that the ancient Greeks would find fossils of megafauna in particularly fossiliferous regions of Greece, which there's a lot of them. And they would interpret these as, hey, these are the giants that the Greek gods killed, in the War of the Titans. And a lot of their mythology seems to be based around these. There's an argument you can see floating around on the internet. Like if you look at an elephant's skull or a mammoth skull, it looks like a cyclops. So this is theorized as like the origin of the cyclops myth, perhaps because there's a giant hole in the head that looks like an eye would go there where the trunk actually goes. And I think Josephus himself says like, yeah, I went to this certain location and they had giant bones on display. And Josephus himself explicitly believes that the giants in Jewish mythology are essentially the same as the giants in Greek mythology. So another complicating factor, if people are interested, is that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think Goliath is roughly 6 feet tall. And then in any modern Bible in the Masoretic text that you open up, he's roughly 9 feet tall. So that's a massive like disparity. I don't think we actually know for certain how tall that biblical period Jews thought that these giants were. So, if it creeps people out theologically, you do have some wiggle room. Like maybe the giants were 6 foot tall. Maybe they were the size of mastodons. It depends on the time period and how you interpret certain texts. But I guess the short answer is I wouldn't say it's like it should be taken as like a necessary belief within Christianity.
I mean, I'm of the more romantic side that says I'd like there to be giants because it'd be cool. But
I would love that. It would be like Indiana Jones stuff.
Oh, yeah.
I'm all for it.
I love the idea of the ancient world just being filled with all these supernatural things, but it does create a lot of problems. I mean, there's a reason why atheists always go for the same 3 things over and over again, because they really want to just, find the lowest common the weakest point on the whole structure, and then just destroy it until there's nothing left. So I think and that we make it easy.
Yeah.
But another one of the things you kind of talk about. So obviously, we're both evolutionists, and we both believe that there probably wasn't a literal Eden in the biblical as the Bible would describe it. But from a literary sense, how does the existence of death before the fall devalue the creation myth? Does it affect it, or does it make it something that's not as valuable in your eyes specifically?
Yeah. So what you're referring to, there's a scholar named J.J. Van E. who did the most comprehensive and sophisticated study of the creation mandate in Genesis 1 that I've ever seen anywhere in the literature, which I spent like weeks trying to find everything that was written on the subject. But he showed essentially that the creation mandate assumes that humanity was told by God to exercise violence and dominion against the animals. That it was essentially a military language to subdue and take conquest of the earth and the animals. And I actually I found that idea really, really cool, actually, and I think it was it ennobles Hebrew mythology. First off, it's more scientifically credible. Like, if you read Answers in Genesis's New Answers book, which is associated with their museum, like, they have a picture of a T-Rex eating a watermelon, and they claim that the reason that the T-Rex is eating the watermelon is because God originally created all the predators that we see in nature to eat vegetation. Because God would never, create suffering in the world, and he would never create animals that would eat each other, because, that would be God creating evil. So, I think the fact that we now know that the Bible actually teaches that there was violence as the initial condition of creation, it ennobles the Bible scientifically, but also I really like how it changes our view of humanity. So, if you look at the young Earth creationist view of humanity, like, think about it. We were created as these docile, soft creatures for a perfect world. And then, everything went to hell, like, after we sinned. And, like, now we find ourselves in this monstrous world with all these predators that we weren't created to deal with. And like, all this suffering and disease. And we're just these docile little sheep that weren't created to deal with it originally. And that's, like, the tragedy of humanity. But I think on this new interpretation, on the new data that we have, we see that humanity is actually, like, we are created to be like warriors, to deal with chaos from the beginning. We have a certain level of aggression within us that's not a product of the fall. That's not like exogenous to human nature. It's like it's actually part of human nature, and it's a good thing. It's deemed good by God. Which I think is that's actually more in line with evolution, because evolution has us created to live in this monstrous world, but we also evolved alongside this monstrous world. So there's a little bit of monstrousness within us, and that's actually a good thing in some circumstances. So I think it's a much more accurate depiction of humanity mythologically. I like it a lot better. I think it conveys the strength that human beings have, which we've measured within psychology. We're pretty resilient creatures.
That's interesting. I mean, so much of the modern, like, understanding of Eden tends to have, like, it tends to be the Platonistic read on it, where it's the same version you see in Milton and Paralandra, where everything is kind of, creation itself is measured against the version of itself that we can best imagine in our head, and that because we sense that we should be better, it haunts us. I think that from a literary sense, it describes the sense of guilt that exists as a human being, in the sense that we know something is wrong with us, and we know something is about us is wrong, and like Milton captures in Paradise Lost, is that that thing is that we're always constantly at war with being, and that we're always constantly bringing hell with us wherever we go by not trying to latch ourselves on to goodness. But I think that answer is interesting, because it kind of resolves the need for the Platonic ideal, where you have to live in the shadow of something before you. Even though from a literary sense, I still think that Platonic ideal is beautiful and probably the more immediately accessible for a lot of people. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I wonder if part of the reason that the Eden myth is so compelling is that, like, I at least, like, I've always my whole life felt this sense that, like, this modern world that we live in, like, I wasn't created for it. Like, my nature doesn't dovetail with it exactly, like, with the Industrial Revolution and, like, the way that we live our lives now. And I know now, because I believe in evolution, that a lot of that is explained by the fact that, like, I wasn't created for the environment that I'm currently in. I've been exiled from that environment, and I can't go back. And, like, it's interesting how that I can see parallels with the Eden myth in that sense. Like, we used to live in this forest and so forth. Yeah, I don't know. I've been thinking about that for a while.
I mean, it's definitely literary in the sense that it captures something. but it does create problems when you take it to be literal, at least literal in the most broad sense. Like I had an idea for a fantasy story I was going to write where the beginning of the book would be basically Paleolithic man is living their savage life, and one of them essentially discovers the island of Purgatory from Dante, and he starts climbing it, and he finds himself in Eden as it's described, and then it retells the Eden narrative up as far as it normally would go, but with the added caveat that he was still a being that was born outside of it, and that the choice was not being born in it and never being able to leave, but being offered the chance to have this thing and refusing it because you could have something else. And I think that it's still a useful idea, but it's definitely one of those things where you have to kind of separate the cultural version of it from the whatever the ancient Hebrews actually thought of it.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think that something like Milton probably does gain a little bit more value once you completely divorce it from the Genesis, like the implications of the Genesis myth, even though, because so many people, that tends to be their version of what the actual the actual Genesis story was, even though most of it's interpretation at best.
Yeah, I also like within ancient Near Eastern creation myths, there's always this assumption built into everything that like chaos is inherent in nature, which like the Creation Museum would deny, but like this view of human nature that we are created from the beginning as like warriors fighting to claim territory from animals and subdue them. It builds in some of that chaos into humanity as well.
It definitely leaves more room for some of the more prickly Old Testament verses. I forget the one where, I forget where it was, but I was discussing this with a Calvinist pastor about last year, and he was telling me that there's a point where God says, "Forgive me for the wrath I'm about to incur upon the human race," and I'm like, "Wait a minute." I guess the idea that there was that the Old Testament's a little more forthcoming with the more brutal aspect of God definitely kind of fits.
Yeah.
Skipping the two questions we kind of agreed we wouldn't be able to answer, but I mean, I guess we can kind of wrap up on this point. But does modern scholarship put Christianity into much of an intellectual bind, in your opinion? I mean, I sent you that video by Trey the Explorer where you see kind of all the there's so much scholarship that's taking a look at a lot of the same data you're looking at and coming some very different opinions about the ancient Hebrews. And I mean, a lot of them think that we're trying to claim that Judaism was essentially polytheistic, that the fact that it was sharing that it's spaced with all these different religions kind of meant that it was just one part of a greater pantheon, or that Judaism was essentially so different from Christianity that it's just not reconcilable. Like, I mean, given how much how much do you think that kind of damages Christianity as a whole? Do you think that like, if you, I guess I'm asking is like, what is the defense of God in light of everything that's coming to light with all this?
Yeah, so well, I think what Trey's referring to in the video was like he's correct. Like, most scholars believe that there's this evolution in the text of the Hebrew Bible, where the earlier texts are essentially polytheistic. They talk about these beings called the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God, who they're gods. They're just straight up called gods. They exist by the exact same name and like similar titles within the Baal texts. There's a roundabout way that you can argue in the Bible that there are 70 of these creatures, and there's 70 of them in the Baal text as well. The Baal texts just straight up say that. And most scholars probably of the Hebrew Bible would say that once you get to later texts, like especially after King Josiah, and a text called Second Isaiah, the second half of Isaiah, that Israelite religion became monotheistic, and like it kind of censored this history in the text of these polytheistic gods, which you can see like would create a lot of theological problems for people. the reason why I don't believe in this narrative is because I've read Michael Heiser's doctoral thesis, which is all about this subject. And there's also a scholar who wrote a doctoral thesis called Nathan MacDonald. The title was Deuteronomy and the Meaning of Monotheism. And I don't know how far to get into this because it's a rabbit hole, but like, the first thing people should understand, it's actually pretty interesting. The word monotheism sounds super ancient, like, but if you look up its etymology and the etymology of polytheism, they were invented in the 17th century, and they're actually horrible terms for describing ancient religion because they were invented by philosophers for philosophic reasons that aren't particularly pertinent to ancient religion. And this is like, so the way this works is like, if you think about the word monotheism, it means one God. What is the definition of God in that phrase? It's a being who is all powerful, who is all knowing, omnipresent, and so forth. Well, how about the word polytheism? What is the meaning of God in that term? It's essentially like what, an angel? It's like this powerful creature. Maybe it controls a certain geography. It's not all powerful. It's not all knowing. It's not necessarily eternal. So the words monotheism and polytheism aren't actually opposites of each other. They're not mutually exclusive. There are all sorts of worldviews that are monotheistic and polytheistic at the same time, in a sense. I would argue that the Stoics, for example, they were, in a sense, monotheistic polytheists because they believe in one divine logos that pervades everything, so it's omnipresent. It's the ground of all morality. But then they talk about the gods, and the gods are thought to be these permutations of the one logos. So they exist, but there's also, the all-powerful, omnipresent logos. So it's kind of a monotheistic, polytheistic system. And I would argue Islam, for example, if people are interested in this, I don't want to go too much on a tangent, but I think Islam is the genie within Islam existed before Islam, and we have texts from, for example, a city called Palmyra that just called them gods. They were like tutelary deities. They held governance over certain geographies. And then when Muhammad wrote the Quran, he just incorporated them as kind of like angels within Christianity. They're lower beings, they're created, they're not all powerful. So Islam believes in these divine, sort of angel-like creatures that exist. You'd call them gods in any other context. But it's not like Islam is monotheistic. No one's going to argue that it's not monotheistic. So essentially, I think all the Abrahamic religions are monotheistic and polytheistic at the same time, if we're going to use those terms. And all right, so Heiser's doctoral thesis and Nathan MacDonald, what they've argued essentially is that when you go to these later texts that are supposed to be monotheistic and erase the polytheism that previously existed, they've argued that actually these divine beings, the divine council, the sons of God, they actually appear all over the place. And they're in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are pretty late. And I know Heiser's written his entire Unseen Realm book to argue that the New Testament authors were totally on board with these divine council beings existing. So yeah, maybe that's not reassuring to people because if you're a Christian, it kind of forces you to believe that there are these gods that exist. But I actually don't think that the Bible contradicts itself, that there's this suppression, this evolution of the existence of these beings. So it doesn't place traditional religion in a bind in that sense. But I think it's actually pretty interesting. We have one thing you mentioned is Christianity. The Christian worldview is so different from the ancient Near Eastern worldview that sometimes it's almost unrecognizable. And I think one of the examples of that is that Christians tend to view all divine beings as just angels. And the divine realm is just angels, which is pretty boring. But if you look at ancient Near Eastern literature, if you look at even the New Testament close enough, there's all sorts of divine beings. There's cherubim, there's seraphim, which are these serpentine beings. we had the sons of God, which aren't exactly angels in the Hebrew sense of that term. And then there's the angels, which are messenger creatures. So yeah, the divine worldview of the Bible is like just filled to the brim with all these fantastic creatures that exist. Hopefully I've answered the question. I've gone a very roundabout way of doing so.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very roundabout question. So it's, I mean, there's a lot of prickly kind of questions that seem to be difficult to answer, and it's why I like conversations like this, because it's easier to kind of talk things through when people understand that there is more than one way to look at this stuff, and that you don't necessarily have to look at it from the one way you've always been taught it. I mean, there's so many people that you bring up any of the concepts we've discussed, they'll have either a conniption and deny it, or it'll just destroy their entire. They'll just put a pinprick in their faith, and they'll just start losing. All the air is going to get sucked out of it. So it's good that there's ways that we can rationalize all this without necessarily having to just say we pulled one Jenga block out of the tower and the whole thing falls down, which is what a lot of both atheists and fundamentalists generally seem to believe. So if you pull one, the whole thing is going to fall down if it isn't read a very particular way.
Yeah, and it's kind of an interesting idea to think about, but I think the way that atheists handle the Bible, young Earth creationists, I guess fundamentalists, I kind of don't like that term because it's kind of vague, but like they're kind of the ones that taught atheists to handle the Bible in that way.
Well, yeah, they're just the same
I think
point,
faith is actually a lot more robust than, for example, the Creation Museum presents it to be. And the facile way that, like, the typical internet atheist might handle the Bible and critique religion, like make fun of, like, look at these anti-scientific examples in the Bible, like Christians kind of taught them how to handle the Bible that way. And that's kind of on the Creation Museum and a lot of young earthers.
Yeah, I mean, they're two sides of the same coin. They're basically peddling the same ideas, just in very aggressively different tones.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't really have much of any other questions, because we've covered a lot, and we could probably go a lot more in depth than any of the rabbit holes that we dug up. But do you want to just kind of tell people where they can find you online, or where they can buy your book?
Yeah, my YouTube name is just my name, Ben Stanhope, and then you can find my book through there. The title of the book is Misinterpreting Genesis: How the Creation Museum Misunderstands the Ancient Near Eastern Context of the Bible. Kind of regret that title, very complicated, very hard for people to remember, but yeah, so there's my YouTube channel and then my academia page, which is just my name, Ben Stanhope. You can find a decent selection of the chapters from the book on my academia page for free if you're interested.
All right. I don't have any questions, but I appreciate kind of being able to go through all this stuff, and I appreciate all the work you're doing. I think I've sent your anti-intellectualism video to like 10 different people just to try to convince them. So.
Yeah. Hey, I appreciate it. Thanks for bringing me on.
Sure. Great to talk to you. Have a great night.
Hey, you too.
The AntiSocial Network is a Groupthink Productions podcast. Editing, producing, and hosting are by Tyler Hummel, artwork by Crystal Cowley, and original music was composed by Melissa LaFira and the late Dan Smolla. Like, subscribe, and please let us know what you think about the show in the comments below if you'd like to see anyone interesting be a guest on the show. Thank you for listening.